Hey guys, Sean here. Now this video is one I've been excited to make. Today, we will be going over the history of Ireland throughout the 19th century, with a focus on things like daily life, technology, and of course, the infamous potato famine. A little backstory before we begin. Ireland is a small-sized European country situated in the North Atlantic. Today, the island of Ireland is split between the Republic of Ireland, a larger, independent nation, and Northern Ireland, a division of the United Kingdom. However, during the 19th century, Ireland was unified and entirely governed by the United Kingdom. Irish history is long and expansive, dating back thousands of years from the Celts to the Romans, but what I like to call the potato famine era of the 19th century was one of the most impactful and significant. Now let's begin. When many people think of Ireland today, we think of wealth, culture, four-leaf clovers, and of course, alcohol. However, it hasn't always been sunshine and rainbows with pots of gold at the end. Life in 19th century Ireland was rough. Poverty was extremely common, and much of the population lived day to day. Class was a major factor to the general population, and one of the ways in which this was visible was in how people dressed. Clothing showed status, and people accepted their status and dressed accordingly. Poor men often wore second-hand clothes, which consisted of pants, suspenders, and a cap. On the other hand, wealthy men could be found with top hats, gloves, tailed suits, and even a decorative cane. Poor women wore dirty, thin dresses, usually made of cotton. Wealthy women also wore hats, more expensive silk dresses, and sometimes even a steel frame to give their dress shape. Now, I can't imagine it'd be very comfortable to walk around with a steel frame dress. But in the Victorian era, wealthy people did not need to do any extreme labor. The ones in the factories or on the railroads were always dirt poor, just making ends meet. And it is important to note that in Ireland in the 1800s, being poor was the norm. For example, an 1841 census in Ireland reported that 40% of people throughout Ireland lived in the lowest class of homes. At this time, houses were grouped into four classes, the lowest of which consisted of a single-room, windowless mud cabin with a thatched roof. With a population of over 8 million at the time, this meant that well over 3 million people in Ireland lived every single day, barely surviving and in terrible conditions. Being a young child in this period wasn't any better. Working-class children had few luxuries, especially when compared to those of today, such as running water, electricity, and entertainment. They constantly ate poor food and lived in filthy, damp conditions, as mentioned earlier. And while more wealthy children were well-fed and clothed, they still did not have exceptional sanitation. Because of this, children of all classes, but especially those in the lower class, frequently died from disease and infection. Even near the turn of the century, when technology and the economies of many nations were rapidly expanding, infant mortality rates across Ireland were staying at 10%. This meant that on average, 100 of 1,000 children died before their first birthday. Compared with Canada today, the infant mortality rate is just 5 deaths per thousand, roughly 20 times lower. To add, most children didn't attend school and were forced to work at a very young age, whether that be in the factories or on farms. But a lot of families had their young boys work on their farms to help with the cultivation of crops because, again, they were struggling to get by. In addition to the less than stellar sanitation came the nightmare of medicine in the 19th century. There were virtually no credentials needed in order to operate on a patient, and people just claimed to be a physician. Most real doctors graduated without any practical knowledge, as it was extremely dangerous. Amputations were a common treatment for infections and otherwise minor problems, and without pain-relieving medicine, it would have been excruciatingly painful. The worst part is that many doctors did not care about hygiene. They wouldn't wash their hands, use protective equipment, or even clean the tools they used. Before the advent of germ theory in the late 1800s, people had no idea what caused infections, and many so-called experts were repulsed by the idea that invisible bacteria were killing their patients. So tragically, many men, women, and children alike perished due to complications involving surgical procedures. The early 1800s saw the vast majority of children and people in general living in the countryside. To put it into numbers, of the 8.2 million people accounted for in the aforementioned 1841 census, only 200,000 lived in the largest city and capital of Dublin. So in short, the whole of Ireland was largely rural and made up of many small farms. Many of these farms relied almost exclusively on potatoes, which is an important detail and will become a problem in the future. Another important detail is that many of these small farms were not owned by the lower class workers who tended to the crops, and were instead rented to tenants by more wealthy landlords. A lot of tenants were not happy about this ownership, and through the course of the 19th century struggled to change that. The 1800s were also the time of the Industrial Revolution, a period of time loosely defined but generally regarded as taking place from the late 18th to the mid-19th century, and then hitting again in a second wave during the 19th century to earliest 20th century. During this time, breakthrough inventions and revolutions seem to be happening frequently. Just a few examples are light bulbs, which replaced gas lamps and candles, motor wagon automobiles, which replaced horses and trains in transportation, the typewriter, which replaced pen and paper, the sewing machine, which replaced needle and thread, along with other inventions which created our own categories, such as the telephone and photography. In addition, the agricultural industry had some major improvements. Horses and oxen began to do some of the plowing, and were later themselves replaced by machines. Railways enabled rural farmers to access city markets and opportunities. Then there was 1845. What exactly happened in 1845? First, remember how I said that a large portion of Irish farmers relied exclusively on potatoes? This was ultimately the main factor in the so-called Great Hunger. Potatoes grew in almost any conditions, were hardy, cheap, and widely available. In addition to this, Britain had established a series of legislatures often referred to as the Corn Laws. The Corn Laws set duties on grain imports to Britain to protect British agriculture from outside competition. This effectively made foods such as corn and bread extremely expensive, and without good enough soil to grow grain natively, the Irish farmers farmed potatoes en masse. Turns out, an entire country being based on the growth of one particular crop can go very, very wrong. In 1845, the potato crop failed. An airborne fungus commonly called potato blight made its way from the Americas. The fungus is easily spread and rots potatoes prematurely, making them inedible. That very same year, half of the potato crop in Ireland was ruined, and over the next 7 years, nearly 75% of the crop was affected by potato blight. Irish leaders in Dublin petitioned for the Queen and British Parliament to act, repealing the Corn Laws. Besides that, however, British assistance was limited to loans, funding soup kitchens, or public free soup, and providing employment and public infrastructure. This had a catastrophic effect on the population of Ireland. Over the same 7-year period, it is estimated that 1 million Irish citizens starved to death, and another 1 million people emigrated away from the famine and the poverty. The subsequent years in the 1850s found communities across Ireland devastated by emigration and death. That same decade, something new started to take shape. Like I said, the United Kingdom were the de facto rulers of Ireland, and had been since the Act of Union from 1802. And during the potato famine, the inaction of the British contributed to a much greater feeling of nationalism in Ireland. The result of this was the emergence of the Irish Republican Brotherhood in 1858, and their aim was to free Ireland from the UK and to create an Irish Republic. This would continue even into the 20th century, ultimately constituting in the Irish War of Independence post-World War I. The 1870s also saw mass political movements on the island. For decades, poor farmers did not own their own land, but by this point in time, the working class were sick of being tenants, renting land from landlords. The National Museum of Ireland describes that many farmers joined the Irish National Land League, founded in 1879, to lobby for lower rents and the ownership of land. So, for a lot of people, gaining the ownership of the land they cultivated was a big deal. Later that same year, the Land League organized mass demonstrations and outbreaks of civil unrest, with the point being the conditions of tenancy and the ownership of the land. Named the Land War, these demonstrations lasted until 1882, when the Land League was disbanded and the leaders were imprisoned. However, this would not stop the Irish public. The Ladies' Land League, formed a year earlier, took over the organizing of the campaigns. Although political unrest died down, rural citizens continued to be affected by political and social change. The years of 1883 onwards are looked at as having relative prosperity for the lower class. First of all, the 1883 Labourers Act provided houses for labourers at low rents. In addition, the rate of emigration finally decreased. The later 1880s saw a series of land acts which revolutionized the landholding system in Ireland, giving the tenants more power over their land. By the 1890s, a substantial number of Irish farmers were finally able to purchase their own land. And with that, the journey is complete. Irish history throughout the 19th century was characterized by innovation, political movement, and of course a famine, which altered the nation's history forever. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and thank you for watching.